For more than 15 centuries, the armies of northern China hurled themselves against the south like waves breaking on coastal cliffs. Dynasties rose and fell. Emperors claimed the mandate of heaven, and yet the lands below the Yangtze River remained stubbornly beyond their grasp. Until suddenly, impossibly, they didn't. To understand this paradox, we must first understand what made southern China so different from anywhere else conquered empires had encountered. Imagine standing on the northern bank of the Yangtze River in the year 500 AD. Behind you stretch the yellow plains of the Central Kingdom, flat lands where cavalry can charge in formation and armies can see their enemies from miles away. Ahead, the landscape transforms into something alien. Mountains rise like broken teeth from the earth. Rivers branch and multiply into networks so complex that even locals debate the best routes. Forests grow so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. This is not merely different terrain. This is a different world entirely. The geography of southern China creates conditions that fundamentally alter how power operates. In the north, conquest follows predictable patterns. An army assembles, marches in formation, meets the enemy on an open field, and the stronger force prevails. Victory means controlling the land, installing administrators, extracting taxes. The formula had worked for millennia across the steppes of Central Asia, the plains of Mesopotamia, the valleys of Europe. But in the south, this formula breaks down at every step. Consider the mountains. The Nanling Range doesn't form a single barrier like the Alps or Pyrenees. Instead, it creates a labyrinth of peaks and valleys, each offering 1,000 places to hide, to ambush, to retreat, and regroup. An army of 10,000 men entering these mountains doesn't move as a single force. It fragments into columns threading through narrow passes, each vulnerable, each unable to support the others. What appears on a map as a week's march becomes a month of stumbling through terrain where every ridge might conceal enemy archers, where every valley could be a trap. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Soldiers from the northern plains, men who have spent their lives under vast open skies, find themselves enclosed on all sides. The horizon shrinks from miles to meters. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. A childhood spent on flat grasslands provides no preparation for fighting in 3 dimensions, where attacks can come from above as easily as from the sides. Fear compounds with each day spent in terrain that feels fundamentally hostile to everything these warriors understand about combat. But terrain alone might be overcome through determination and numbers. What amplifies the defensive advantage is how this landscape interacts with the river systems. The Yangtze and its countless tributaries don't merely provide water. They create a transportation network that favors those who know it intimately. A defending force can retreat by boat faster than pursuing cavalry can march. They can strike a northern garrison, fade into the river network, and emerge days later hundreds of miles away to strike again. For the locals, the rivers are highways. For invaders, they're mazes with no exit. This creates what military theorists would later call asymmetric warfare, though the concept existed long before the term. A smaller, weaker force that knows the terrain can bleed a larger, stronger force through 1,000 small cuts. Northern armies learned this lesson repeatedly. A campaign that should take months stretches into years. Victories in individual battles mean nothing because the enemy never fully commits to a decisive engagement. Territory conquered during the dry season must be abandoned when the monsoons make rivers impassable and supply lines vanish beneath floodwaters. And then there's the invisible enemy, the one that kills more surely than any sword. Disease transformed southern China into a graveyard for northern armies. Malaria, dysentery, and a host of tropical ailments that had known names in Chinese medical texts of the era waited in the humid air, the stagnant water, the very soil. Southern populations had been exposed to these diseases for generations. Some had developed partial immunity. Others had learned which water sources to avoid, which seasons brought the worst outbreaks, how to recognize symptoms early. This knowledge passed from parent to child as naturally as learning to speak. Northern soldiers possessed none of this inherited wisdom. They drank from rivers that locals knew to avoid. They camped in valleys that seemed pleasant but harbored disease. They marched through wet rice paddies without understanding that every step increased their risk of infection. Within weeks of entering the South, a northern army would begin losing men to illness. Within months, disease casualties would outnumber combat deaths by factors of 10 or 20 to 1. Imagine being a commander watching your force dissolve not through defeat in battle, but through invisible forces you don't understand and cannot fight. Your soldiers develop fevers. They weaken. They die. The locals seem unaffected, which breeds suspicion of poison or sorcery. Morale collapses not just from fear of disease, but from the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that cannot be seen or challenged. Men who would charge into spears without hesitation become paralyzed with terror at the prospect of another night in the southern heat, surrounded by swarms of mosquitoes that seem to carry death in their bite. From an economic perspective, this attrition made conquest irrational. The cost in lives and silver to put an army in the south exceeded any plausible return from controlling the territory. A northern emperor might spend the equivalent of years of tax revenue to equip and supply a southern campaign, only to watch his army melt away before accomplishing anything permanent. Even successful occupations became economically unsustainable as garrison troops required constant replacement, and the survivors often became too sick to fight effectively. But perhaps the most elegant defense southern China possessed was written into the land itself, in the rice paddies that carpeted every valley and plain. Wet rice cultivation is not farming in the way northern wheat or millet cultivation is farming. It's a form of agricultural engineering that requires intimate knowledge built up over lifetimes. The paddies must be leveled precisely so water distributes evenly. Irrigation channels must be maintained with mathematical precision. Planting must occur at exact times coordinated with monsoon patterns. The entire system depends on understanding countless variables that determine whether the crop succeeds or fails. This created a profound economic vulnerability for any occupying force. Northern armies understood plunder-based warfare. You conquer a region, seize the stored grain, take the livestock, extract whatever wealth exists, then move on. This worked perfectly in the north where agriculture produced easily portable surpluses. But in the south, wealth existed in the system itself, in the knowledge required to make the land productive. You could seize a rice paddy, but without understanding how to maintain the irrigation, how to time the planting, how to manage the water levels through the growing season, you possessed only mud. Southern defenders understood this asymmetry and exploited it ruthlessly. When northern armies approached, locals would breach the irrigation systems. Water drained away or flooded the paddies incorrectly, destroying the crop. The land a northern force conquered produced nothing. Meanwhile, the locals who had fled into the mountains or across the rivers possessed the knowledge to rebuild the system once the invaders left or starved. This scorched earth strategy worked because it destroyed not physical infrastructure that could be rebuilt, but the agricultural output that couldn't be replaced without specialized knowledge. The occupying force faced an impossible choice. They could try to learn the complex rice cultivation techniques, which would take years and required cooperation from locals who had every incentive to provide false information. Or they could attempt to import food from the north, which meant maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Or they could simply leave. Most chose the third option eventually. This economic reality shaped military decision-making in ways that are easy to overlook from a distance of centuries. A general considering whether to pursue a southern campaign had to calculate not just whether his army could win battles, but whether victory would mean anything. Could he hold the territory long enough to extract value from it? Could he maintain supply lines indefinitely? Could he replace losses from disease faster than they accumulated? The honest answer to all three questions was usually no. But emperors being emperors, and ambition being ambition, the campaigns happened anyway, and failed anyway, for over 1,000 years. Yet geography and disease and agricultural systems explain only part of southern China's resistance. The people themselves had developed something equally formidable, something that existed not in the landscape, but in their minds and institutions. The cultural identity of southern China formed in opposition to the north, and this oppositional identity became a source of remarkable resilience. To understand this, we must travel back to before China was China, to the ancient kingdoms of Chu and Wu that flourished in the south while the northern states were still consolidating what would become the Central Plains culture. These southern kingdoms were different. Their languages carried tones and rhythms distinct from northern dialects. Their religious practices blended shamanism with early forms of Taoism, emphasizing harmony with nature rather than the hierarchical order that Confucianism would later champion in the north. Their art featured flowing, organic forms rather than the rigid symmetry northern aesthetics preferred. Even their concept of kingship differed, with southern rulers claiming authority through spiritual connection to the land rather than purely through military and administrative power. When the Qin dynasty unified China in 221 BC, it did so through military conquest that was particularly brutal in the south. The subsequent Han dynasty attempted cultural unification, imposing northern administrative systems and Confucian ideology. But cultural identities, once formed, possess an inertia that laws and edicts cannot easily overcome. The South complied on the surface while maintaining its distinctiveness beneath. This created a pattern that would repeat for centuries. Northern dynasties would claim to rule the South, would install governors and tax collectors, but the deep cultural structures remained fundamentally Southern. Psychology offers insight into why this cultural resilience mattered militarily. In-group and out-group identity formation is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. When people identify strongly with their group and see outsiders as fundamentally different, they become willing to endure extraordinary hardship to resist outside control. The Southern Chinese didn't just see northern invaders as political enemies. They saw them as culturally alien, as representatives of a different way of understanding the world. This manifested in countless small acts of resistance that added up to making occupation impossible. A southern farmer might technically pay taxes to northern officials, but he would underreport his harvest. Local magistrates might formally submit to northern authority, but they would slow-walk directives and misinterpret orders. Information would flow perfectly through southern networks while northern administrators operated in a fog of deliberate confusion. None of these acts individually constituted rebellion, but collectively they created an environment where northern control existed only as a thin veneer over a society that fundamentally rejected it. Compare this to other instances of cultural resistance throughout history. The Welsh maintained their language and identity through centuries of English rule. Catalans preserved their culture despite centuries of Castilian dominance. In each case, the oppositional identity became stronger precisely because it was opposed, creating a psychological reinforcement loop. Persecution or pressure from outside strengthens in-group bonds, which increases willingness to resist, which invites more pressure, which strengthens bonds further. The south and north of China locked into this pattern early and maintained it for over a millennium. But cultural identity alone might have been insufficient without the economic and political structures that gave it teeth. And here we encounter one of the most fascinating patterns in Chinese history, the exile economy. Whenever the north fell to invasion, whether from steppe nomads or internal collapse, the elites fled south. When the Han dynasty crumbled, aristocratic families took their wealth, their libraries, their artisans and scholars, and retreated across the Yangtze. When the Tang dynasty imploded during the Lushan rebellion, the same pattern repeated. Each wave of refugees brought not just capital but knowledge, administrative expertise, and most importantly, legitimacy. This created a curious dynamic. The South became a sanctuary for what claimed to be the real China, the legitimate continuation of civilization against barbarian disruption. The Eastern Jin dynasty, ruling from the southern city of Jiankong, styled itself as the true heir to the Jin despite controlling only a fraction of the traditional Chinese territory. Centuries later, the Southern Song would make the same claim, arguing that they, not the Northern Jin dynasty, held the mandate of heaven. From an economic history perspective, this refugee pattern transformed the South in ways that made it genuinely superior to the North in certain dimensions. Each wave of displacement brought an infusion of human capital. Northern scholars established academies in southern cities. Artisans brought techniques for producing silk, porcelain, and metalwork to new regions. Merchants expanded trade networks. Farmers introduced new crops and farming methods. The Jiangnan region, centered around modern-day Shanghai and Hangzhou, urbanized and developed an economy sophisticated enough to rival anything in the world at that time. This economic dynamism created a feedback loop that strengthened southern independence. A wealthier South could afford better defenses. A more urbanized South developed a merchant class with interests in maintaining independence from northern taxation. A more educated South produced more effective administrators and military strategists. The brain drain from North to South during times of crisis was also a brain gain that compounded over centuries. The psychological dimension of this exile economy matters immensely. The southern kingdoms could claim they represented civilization against barbarism, culture against chaos. This wasn't merely propaganda. When northern China was ruled by Xinbei dynasties or Khitan emperors, the South genuinely preserved aspects of Chinese high culture that had been disrupted in the North. The South became the repository of cultural memory, the place where the classics were still studied, where the old rituals were still performed, where Chinese identity was maintained in its purest form, or so the narrative went. This narrative had power because it aligned with deeper philosophical concepts embedded in Chinese political thought. The mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers held authority through cosmic approval rather than mere force, created an opening for southern resistance. If a northern dynasty was ruled by foreign invaders, could they truly hold the mandate? If a northern emperor couldn't perform the proper rituals or lacked understanding of Chinese philosophical tradition, was he really the son of heaven? Southern propagandists exploited these questions relentlessly, framing northern rulers as usurpers who might control territory but lacked the spiritual and cultural authority that made rule legitimate. Yet for all this cultural and economic strength, the South possessed one final advantage that proved decisive in repelling northern invasions for centuries: naval power. The northern steppe peoples who repeatedly conquered northern China, the Xiongnu, the Xianbei, the Khitan, the Jurchen, were horse peoples. Their military dominance came from cavalry tactics refined over centuries of warfare on the grasslands. A Mongol or Khitan horseman was a devastating weapon on open terrain. But horses don't swim well, and cavalry charges don't work on water. The South developed naval capabilities that had no parallel in the North. Riverine warfare became a sophisticated art. Southern shipwrights built vessels specifically designed for the shallow, fast-moving rivers of the region. Southern commanders developed tactics for fighting from boats, for coordinating naval and land forces, for using the river systems both defensively and offensively. When northern armies reached the Yangtze or the countless smaller rivers that webbed across the South, they found themselves facing an enemy in an element where all their traditional advantages vanished. This wasn't merely a military asymmetry. It was an economic one. The South controlled maritime trade routes that connected China to Southeast Asia, India, and eventually the Islamic world and Africa. Southern ports handled goods from across the known world: spices, precious woods, gems, exotic animals. Northern dynasties could dominate the overland Silk Road, but the maritime trade that flowed through southern ports generated wealth that remained largely beyond their grasp. Southern kingdoms weaponized this economic advantage. They could blockade access to luxury goods that northern elites craved. Tea, silk, and porcelain produced in the South became leverage in negotiations. A northern dynasty might control more territory, but if its merchants couldn't access southern ports, its economy suffered. This economic warfare operated on timescales longer than military campaigns, creating chronic pressure that sapped northern will to continue trying to conquer what seemed increasingly unconquerable. The parallels to other historical examples of naval asymmetry are striking. The Byzantine Empire survived for 1,000 years partly through naval dominance that allowed it to maintain trade routes and resupply cities by sea even when surrounded on land. Venice became a power vastly disproportionate to its size through control of Mediterranean maritime trade. The southern Chinese kingdoms operated on similar principles, using control of waterways and naval superiority to offset northern advantages in cavalry and numbers. But perhaps the most important parallel is to Vietnam's resistance against Chinese conquest. The Vietnamese, facing similar geographic and climatic conditions to southern China, developed similar defensive strategies. They used rivers and forests for guerrilla warfare. They weaponized disease and unfamiliar terrain against invaders. They maintained a cultural identity defined in opposition to Chinese domination. The Vietnamese succeeded in maintaining independence where the South Chinese ultimately did not, which raises the question: what changed? What allowed the Mongols to succeed where so many others had failed? For over a millennium, the pattern held. Northern dynasties would grow powerful, would eye the wealthy South with ambition, would launch campaigns that initially seemed successful, and would eventually withdraw, defeated by the combination of geography, disease, economic reality, and cultural resistance that made the South unconquerable. Dynasty after dynasty learned this lesson, until the Mongols arrived with something no previous conqueror possessed. The Mongol conquest of China began like so many before it, with initial attacks focused on northern territories. Genghis Khan's armies swept through the Jin dynasty in the north, demonstrating the overwhelming cavalry superiority that had already conquered half of Eurasia. But when Mongol forces first probed southward in the 1230s, they encountered the same barriers that had stopped so many others. Mountains negated their cavalry advantage. Diseases decimated their ranks. The river systems provided defensive depth impossible to overcome through traditional steppe warfare tactics. The initial Mongol campaigns in the south failed, completely and repeatedly. Mongol generals, accustomed to sweeping victories across the steppes of Central Asia, found themselves frustrated by an enemy that wouldn't meet them in open battle, terrain that nullified their advantages, and supply problems that had no military solution. For 2 decades, the Mongols battered against the south and made no meaningful progress. A lesser empire might have given up, concluded that some territories weren't worth the cost, and focused on consolidating gains elsewhere. But here we encounter something psychologically remarkable about the Mongol approach to conquest, a capacity for institutional learning that was rare among military powers of the era. Most empires doubled down on what made them successful. If cavalry charges won battles on the steppes, then the solution to southern resistance must be more cavalry, better cavalry, different cavalry tactics. The Mongols did something different. They recognized that their traditional methods wouldn't work and systematically set about acquiring new ones. This willingness to adapt represented a fundamental shift in mindset. From a behavioral economics perspective, we might frame this as overcoming sunk cost fallacy at an imperial scale. The Mongols had invested decades and countless lives into developing the most effective cavalry-based military system in history. The rational response to encountering problems that cavalry couldn't solve would be to double down on the proven method. Instead, the Mongols chose to invest in entirely new capabilities, accepting short-term costs and uncertainty for the possibility of long-term success. The Mongols began hiring Chinese engineers, naval architects, and administrative experts. They recruited Song Dynasty defectors who understood southern warfare and were willing to share that knowledge for gold or revenge or survival. They studied previous campaigns, both successful and failed, analyzing why the Tang dynasty had briefly conquered the south and why that conquest hadn't lasted. They approached warfare as a portfolio problem, diversifying their capabilities rather than relying on a single dominant strategy. This organizational learning manifested in concrete innovations. The Mongols adopted siege warfare technology at a scale unprecedented in East Asia. They imported Muslim engineers from conquered territories in Central Asia who brought knowledge of counterweight trebuchets far more powerful than the traction trebuchets China had used for centuries. They learned to construct siege equipment on-site rather than attempting to transport it across difficult terrain. They studied the principles of gunpowder weapons, still relatively primitive but potentially decisive in siege situations. Most remarkably, the Mongols built a navy from scratch. A people who had lived their entire history on grasslands, who had no cultural tradition of seafaring, recognized that naval power was essential to conquering the south and set about acquiring it. They recruited Song naval officers who defected or were captured. They captured southern shipyards and forced the workers to build vessels for Mongol use. They practiced riverine warfare through trial and error, accepting initial defeats as learning opportunities rather than insurmountable obstacles. The parallel to Roman adaptation during the Punic Wars is instructive. Rome, initially a land power with minimal naval capability, faced Carthage's dominant navy and responded by reverse engineering captured ships and developing the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into the kind of infantry combat where Romans excelled. Like the Romans, the Mongols recognized that adapting to the enemy's strengths was more effective than simply trying to overpower those strengths through traditional means. But perhaps the most significant Mongol innovation was strategic patience combined with economic warfare. Previous northern dynasties had attempted quick, decisive campaigns, trying to conquer the south through military brilliance and overwhelming force. The Mongols recognized that the South's advantages made quick victory impossible. Instead, they planned for a campaign measured in decades, not years. They established supply depots throughout conquered northern territories. They adapted to rice agriculture, learning how to maintain the complex irrigation systems rather than destroying them. They demonstrated a willingness to invest in infrastructure that wouldn't pay returns for years or decades. This long-term thinking aligned with another strategic shift, prioritizing economic strangulation over military conquest. The Mongols recognized that the South's wealth came partly from trade, and trade required access to routes and markets. Mongol control of Central Asia and northern China meant they could choke off both overland and maritime trade routes. They could blockade ports. They could seize control of the Yangtze's middle reaches, cutting the river network that had been the South's highway and defensive moat. By slowly, systematically cutting away the South's economic foundations, they could make continued resistance unsustainable regardless of how effective Southern military defense remained. The turning point came at Xianyang, a fortress city controlling a critical position on the Han River, a major tributary of the Yangtze. The siege lasted 5 years, from 1268 to 1273, and became a microcosm of why the Mongol approach worked where others had failed. Xianyang was considered impregnable. Its walls were thick and high, its defenses designed by the finest military engineers in the Song dynasty. It was supplied by water routes that the Song navy controlled. Its garrison was large and well-trained. Previous sieges had failed after months of trying. Everything about the fortress suggested that besieging it was futile. The Mongols besieged it anyway. They built their own navy to blockade the river approaches. They constructed siege fortifications surrounding the city, turning the siege into a years-long war of attrition. And crucially, they brought in Muslim engineers who constructed counterweight trebuchets larger and more powerful than anything previously seen in China. These weapons could hurl projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds with devastating accuracy. The psychological impact of these weapons exceeded their tactical effectiveness. The defenders of Xianyang had calculated that their walls could withstand traditional siege weapons. When sections of wall began crumbling under bombardment from weapons that shouldn't exist, the psychological effect was profound. The Mongols weren't just another northern dynasty trying to conquer the South. They were something new, something that could overcome barriers that had protected the South for centuries. When Xianyang fell after 5 years, the message resonated throughout the South. If a fortress considered impregnable could be taken, was anywhere safe? The fall of Xianyang triggered a cascade of psychological effects that undermined Southern resistance more effectively than any number of battlefield victories. It demonstrated that the Mongols possessed not just military power but the patience and adaptability to overcome any defense, given enough time. The Song dynasty's response to the crisis revealed deep dysfunctions in its decision-making structures. Factional infighting at court paralyzed strategic planning. Officials more concerned with political rivalry than military reality blocked reforms and refused to support competent commanders. Resources that should have gone to defense were diverted to court expenses or personal enrichment. Individual bureaucrats might recognize the severity of the situation, but collective decision-making processes produced incoherence and delay. This pattern appears throughout history in civilizations facing existential threats. The late Roman Empire suffered similar coordination failures as factional fights prevented effective response to barbarian invasions. The Byzantine Empire's loss of Anatolia to the Turks resulted partly from court politics undermining military commanders. Ming Dynasty China would later fall to the Manchus partly through the same combination of external pressure and internal dysfunction. When collective decision-making breaks down, even strong civilizations can collapse with shocking speed. The final conquest came not through a single decisive battle, but through systematic, methodical advance. After Xianyang, the Mongols controlled the middle Yangtze, cutting the river network that had been the South's primary defensive advantage. They could now move armies and supplies by water, using the same rivers that had previously protected the Song. The Song Navy, which had been the ultimate guarantor of southern security, found itself outmatched by a Mongol fleet built with captured ships and defector expertise. The end came in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen, a naval engagement off the coast of Guangdong. The last Song emperor, a child, was taken aboard a ship as his ministers attempted to evacuate him to safety. When the battle turned against the Song, a loyal minister reportedly took the boy emperor in his arms and jumped into the sea rather than allow him to be captured. The Song dynasty, the last bastion of southern Chinese independence, ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with a desperate leap into dark water. The psychological aftermath of this defeat rippled through southern society. For over 1,000 years, the pattern had held. The South could be attacked but not conquered, threatened but not subjugated. The Mongol victory shattered that certainty. The belief that geography and culture provided absolute security evaporated. In its place came questions about what it meant to resist, whether resistance was even possible, whether the old certainties about southern invincibility had been illusion all along. From a game theory perspective, the Mongol conquest solved a coordination problem that had plagued northern dynasties for centuries. Southern resistance worked because millions of people coordinated their behavior around the belief that resistance was possible and worthwhile. Farmers hid grain from tax collectors. Officials slow-walked northern directives. Merchants maintained trade networks that excluded northern participation. This coordination required no central direction, just shared belief in its effectiveness. The fall of Shenyang and the final conquest disrupted that coordinating belief. If resistance was futile, why risk punishment through resistance? Defection cascades followed, where individuals and groups who might have resisted instead accommodated, which made resistance even more futile for those who remained, which triggered more defection. Yet the Mongol victory revealed something deeper about the nature of conquest itself, something that would only become clear in the decades that followed. The Mongols conquered the South militarily, but in doing so, they were conquered culturally. The Yuan dynasty that ruled China adopted Chinese administrative systems because the Mongol systems designed for ruling pastoral nomads couldn't manage the complexity of Chinese agricultural society. They adopted Chinese court rituals because governing required legitimacy, and legitimacy in China required conformity to Chinese cultural expectations. They employed Chinese bureaucrats because no one else possessed the knowledge to run the tax system, maintain the irrigation networks, manage the urban centers. Within 2 generations, Mongol identity in China had diluted dramatically. Mongol rulers took Chinese names, studied Chinese classics, employed Chinese advisors, and increasingly thought of themselves as Chinese emperors who happened to have Mongol ancestry rather than as Mongol conquerors ruling a Chinese possession. The language of the court shifted from Mongolian to Chinese. The religious practices blended Mongol shamanism with Chinese Buddhism and Taoism until they were indistinguishable. This pattern of conquerors being conquered by the culture they dominated appears throughout history. The Manchus would later conquer China and experience similar cultural absorption. The Normans conquered England in 1066, but within a few generations, they had become English in culture, if not in bloodline. The Mongols dominated India militarily but adopted Indian court culture and administrative practices. Anthropologically, this speaks to the resilience of cultural systems compared to political ones. Political power can be seized through military force in a matter of years or decades. Cultural transformation requires either genocide, which the Mongols didn't attempt, or generations of pressure that gradually changes how people think, speak, worship, and organize their lives. And when the conquerors are outnumbered hundreds to 1 by the conquered, when they need the conquered population's cooperation to actually govern, cultural influence flows from conquered to conqueror more readily than the reverse. From an economic perspective, the conquest changed remarkably little about how the South actually functioned. The trade routes continued operating. The rice paddies were cultivated using the same techniques by the same families. The urban workshops produced the same goods through the same methods. The economic networks that had made the South wealthy persisted because they were embedded in knowledge and practice that couldn't be changed through political decree. The Mongols could seize the surplus these systems produced, but they couldn't fundamentally alter the systems themselves without destroying the source of that surplus. This raises a profound question about what conquest actually means. The Mongols controlled the territory of southern China. They appointed officials and collected taxes. By any political or military definition, they had conquered the South. But had they really? The South continued functioning according to its own logic, its own cultural patterns, its own economic structures. The cultural identity that had defined southern resistance persisted, simply accommodating a new set of rulers who would, the South correctly predicted, eventually become indistinguishable from previous Chinese dynasties. Who really won? The military answer is clear: the Mongols conquered the South. But the cultural and economic answer is far more ambiguous. The South absorbed its conquerors, maintained its essential character, and continued developing along trajectories established long before the Mongols arrived. The Mongol conquest represented not a break in southern Chinese history, but a continuation under temporary management by outsiders who would, in time, cease to be outsiders. This paradox illuminates a pattern that extends far beyond southern China. Military conquest and cultural or economic dominance are different phenomena that sometimes align but often don't. The United States military occupied Iraq and Afghanistan, but never dominated either culturally or economically in ways that fundamentally transformed those societies. The Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe politically for decades, but never achieved cultural hegemony that survived its military withdrawal. Power takes many forms, and military power, for all its immediate visibility, often proves less durable than cultural and economic forms that operate through persuasion, habit, and embedded practice rather than force. The story of southern China offers lessons that echo through time. Vietnam's resistance to American military power in the 1960s and 70s followed patterns remarkably similar to southern China's medieval resistance. Geography and culture created asymmetries that superior firepower couldn't overcome. The ability to retreat, regroup, and maintain coordination across a dispersed population proved decisive against an enemy optimized for conventional warfare. The invading power could win every major battle and still lose the war because holding territory meant nothing if the population refused to be governed. Afghanistan's reputation as the graveyard of empires follows the same logic. British armies in the 19th century, Soviet armies in the 20th, American armies in the 21st all discovered that conquering territory in Afghanistan is vastly easier than governing it. The terrain provides defensive depth. The population maintains cultural cohesion through tribal and religious identities that outside powers can disrupt but not destroy. The cost of occupation exceeds any plausible benefit extraction, making the venture economically irrational even when militarily achievable. Modern urban guerrilla warfare applies these principles to cities rather than mountains and rivers. Dispersed networks of resistors exploit superior local knowledge, creating asymmetries where conventional military advantages become liabilities. A force optimized for symmetrical warfare against other conventional military struggles against enemies who refuse to fight conventionally, who blur the lines between civilian and combatant, who turn the urban terrain itself into a weapon. From a behavioral economics perspective, these conflicts reveal how humans systematically miscalculate in warfare. The sunk cost fallacy drives continued investment in campaigns long after rational cost-benefit analysis would suggest withdrawal. Political leaders escalate commitment to avoid admitting failure, throwing good resources after bad in a psychological spiral that has destroyed empires. Information asymmetry between invaders and defenders creates systematic advantages for the latter that don't show up in metrics like troop numbers or firepower, but matter enormously for outcomes. The conquest of southern China also speaks to how humans think about security. Geography provides advantages, but no geographical advantage is absolute. The South's mountains, rivers, and diseases created barriers that proved insurmountable for centuries, until they weren't. The danger in any defensive strategy is believing that what has worked will always work, that patterns that held for generations will hold forever. Security is not a state, but a process, requiring constant adaptation to evolving threats. Yet the cultural resilience of the South demonstrates that military conquest doesn't equate to total dominance. The Mongols achieved what seemed impossible, conquered what appeared unconquerable, and in doing so revealed that conquest itself is more complex than simple military victory. True conquest requires not just defeating armies and seizing territory, but transforming the fundamental patterns of life in the conquered region. This kind of transformation is vastly harder than military victory and often proves impossible. The question of what it means to conquer a place, to truly dominate it, remains relevant in an era where military occupation is recognized as costly and often counterproductive. Modern great power competition increasingly focuses on soft power, economic integration, and cultural influence rather than territorial conquest. China's Belt and Road Initiative seeks to create dependencies through infrastructure investment rather than military occupation. American influence operates largely through cultural exports and economic ties rather than formal empire. The recognition that cultural and economic dominance can be more durable than military conquest reflects lessons that southern China taught over centuries. The philosophical conclusion that emerges from this history is humbling. No fortress is impregnable indefinitely, no advantage lasts forever, no pattern of success guarantees future success. Adaptation beats tradition in evolving conflicts. Those who learn and change survive. Those who rely on what worked in the past eventually face an opponent who has learned to neutralize those advantages. The Mongols succeeded not through greater courage or numbers, but through willingness to abandon what made them successful in favor of methods appropriate to the challenge they faced. Yet equally important is recognizing that military conquest is not the final word. Cultural resilience operates on timescales that exceed political control. The identity that made southern China resistant to northern rule survived the Mongol conquest, survived the subsequent Ming and Qing dynasties, and persists in modified form today. The economic patterns established in the medieval South still shape regional development. The cultural memory of resistance, of maintaining identity against pressure, remains embedded in how southern Chinese understand themselves. This speaks to a deeper truth about human communities. We are not merely individuals reacting to immediate circumstances. We are bearers of cultural patterns, inheritors of knowledge and practice accumulated over generations, embedded in networks of meaning that give our lives context and purpose. These cultural structures can be damaged or disrupted, but not easily destroyed. They persist through oppression, adapt to new circumstances, and ultimately shape conquerors as much as conquerors shape them. The Yangtze River still flows through the heart of China, its waters carrying the same silt they carried 1,000 years ago. The mountains still rise above the rice paddies. The landscape that shaped medieval warfare shapes modern development, creating regions of distinct identity within a unified nation. Geography shaped history, but humans shape the meaning of that history through how they remember, interpret, and build upon it. The story of southern China teaches that resistance takes many forms. Military defeat doesn't equate to cultural surrender. Economic integration doesn't eliminate distinct identity. Political control doesn't guarantee cultural transformation. The patterns that allowed the South to resist northern conquest for centuries didn't disappear when the Mongols finally succeeded. They adapted, persisted in new forms, and continued shaping how people understood themselves and their relationship to power. Perhaps the ultimate lesson is that conquest is never complete. Military victories are temporary. Cultural patterns endure. Economic systems embed themselves in landscape and practice. Human communities maintain identity across centuries of political change. The Mongols conquered southern China, but southern China, in its own way, conquered the Mongols, absorbing them into patterns of life that pre-existed their arrival and would outlast their rule. In the end, the paradox remains. For 15 centuries, the South could not be conquered, until it was. And yet, in being conquered, it revealed that military conquest is only one dimension of a far more complex interaction between power, culture, geography, and human resilience. The armies of the North finally crossed the Yangtze and claimed victory. But the South, in its essence, remained unconquered, shaped by forces deeper and more enduring than any emperor's decree or general strategy could reach.